So while we wait for people trickling in, David and Colton, let's dive straight into some icebreaker questions. So what I like to do is ask the attendees some basic questions that I stole from the Lenny's podcast. Maybe Colton, given your experience, you might know Lenny. He's probably the best product newsletter out there. And so he always asks the same questions to his guests as well. So the first question that I want to ask to both you and David, what's a recent book or a book that you recommend most to other people? Maybe Colton, we can start with you.
So I read a couple. I usually read like nonfiction in the morning, and I read fiction at night. I'm like a big sci-fi fantasy nerd. So the morning book, I would say, like the book I always recommend from a healthcare perspective is The Innovator's Prescription by Clayton Christensen. Obviously, I really like The Innovator's Dilemma, but I think it really provides some thoughts around kind of the general structure of the healthcare industry for a lot of people. And it was written a while ago, but it's proven to be pretty prescient, which is great. And then I'm trying to think of what I read at night recently. I just finished a book called The Will of the Many by James Islington. If you like fantasy books, or if you've read The Name of the Wind or any of those books, it's very much like that. So probably the best book I've read in a couple of years, actually.
Nice. I will check that out. And David, do you still have time to read books with all the stuff that you need to handle at Oak Street?
I only read probably half the books that Colton recommends for me, but the book that which is very old and not an original, but is I really love Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kahneman, the behavioral economics person. To me, it's like a operating manual to the mind. And I use it both to understand my own decision making, understand the decision making of my patients, and as an executive, trying to lead change with others. It's just so practical and useful, and it's so dense that I think I've read it over and over again. So I often recommend it, even though I don't know how often people actually read through the end of it, given its length and depth.
It's a hard book to read in one go, but I do agree that it's a very important book to read. And so besides the books, which is obviously very serious, do you also have like a recent movie or TV series that you would recommend others to also take a look at?
I just started The Three Body Problem on Netflix. I've read those books. I think that's a fun one. Well, fun's probably not the right word to use for that one. But I think that's really where that's the only thing I'm watching right now. I don't think I've watched a TV series in a while.
I've read those books too and enjoyed it, but don't have a movie selection recommendation right now.
Any movie that comes to mind on your end, David?
I just finally saw Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is an old one. Obviously, I'm still catching up on things, but that was certainly it resonated a lot with me. It had me in tears by the end, also laughing throughout it. So I love that movie.
I have a 4-year-old, so I pretty much just watch Encanto over and over again.
My recommendation is always the same. I watch Shrek 2 like probably every 3 months. So whenever I feel down, I watch some Shrek. But Everything Everywhere All at Once is probably maybe a better choice. Okay, thank you for that. I will definitely write down those book recommendations as well. Now we have, I think about 600 people signed up for this webinar. So thank you, all of the people that signed up, but also obviously thank you, Colton and David, for making the time to meet with us today. So what would be extremely helpful if you can quickly introduce yourself to the audience to set the stage, and maybe David, we can start with you.
Happy to. Dr. David Buchanan. I'm a 25-year veteran primary care provider here in Chicago. I still see patients. For the last 6 years, I've been the chief clinical officer at Oak Street Health. And I'm currently, as of the last few weeks, the Chief Innovation Officer for Healthcare Delivery at CVS. The healthcare delivery division includes Oak Street Health and a number of other business units. And I would say my passion is using engineering and design principles to maximize patient outcomes. And using this approach, the last two organizations I've helped to lead have achieved the top percentile clinical performance nationally. Something I'm very proud of. And I'm fortunate that now improving patient outcomes is actually important from a business perspective too, and it's critical for success in value-based care. So it feels like, improving patient outcomes was sort of a hobby of mine, and now it's actually a defined job in healthcare too, which is a nice change.
David's the most interesting man in the world. I've been working with him for 5 years, and I feel like I hear a new story every time we talk, and we talk a lot. So if you ever get a chance to talk to David, ask him to tell you some stories.
I will definitely ask you to tell some stories today, David. Colton, can you also quickly introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Colton Ortolf. I'm the head of product and design at Oak Street. I've been at Oak Street for about 5 years, working very closely with David. Not nearly the same depth of experience as David has, but I've spent about a decade in healthcare, first as a management consultant or a tech consultant, but more recently working in product. I did some work at Athena Health as a product intern. I worked at Tempest Labs as a product manager, and have been at Oak Street ever since. So very excited to talk about this, because I think the topic is very aligned with the work that we do at Oak Street.
Yeah, and obviously the audience knows Oak Street a little, but what would help is if you, maybe David, can you explain what the North Star metric is for Oak Street?
Sure. Oak Street Health is a network of primary care centers. We now have over 200 centers in 25 states, but Oak Street just started 11 years ago. So in the healthcare world, where many organizations have been around for a century or longer, we're still new. As far as North Star metrics, it does vary a little bit depending on the team. Like the growth teams, KP, most important North Star is growth. But I would say if there's a top level one for the whole organization, it's probably admissions per 1,000. These are hospital admissions for our patients. And the reason why that's so important is in the patient population that Oak Street serves, 2/3 of all medical costs come from acute hospitalizations and the post-hospital care. And so if you're looking to reduce overall medical costs to succeed in value-based care, you better be paying attention to admissions. The nice thing is that, of course, patients don't like to get sick and go to the hospital either. So it's very aligned between kind of what we need to do from a med cost reduction perspective and what patients would want us to do. And finally, it's something that clinical teams can really rally behind, because what they also want to come to work every day to keep people from getting sick, as we try to do in primary care. So admissions per 1,000 is really the top level metric for the organization, but we do need our growth team to help us grow, because if we don't have any patients, reducing admissions doesn't matter. So.
And so you obviously have a lot of providers. How is that North Star then communicated to them? Is it like a dashboard that they can see every day, like seeing the number go down, or how do I need to see that?
Yes, we do have a lot of dashboards, and definitely admissions is on there. Admissions is kind of a strange metric because it's kind of backward looking to some degree. I mean, there are people in the hospital today, and we do show them the list of people who they're taking care of who are in the hospital right now. But if you look at admissions per 1,000, that's usually a trailing metric. It's also kind of a collection of somewhat rare events. A typical patient is not in the hospital today out of a panel. So, we, on a day-to-day basis, we focus also on the kind of process metrics that we believe, if followed well, will drive down admissions. So I would say, we primarily want our care teams to focus on those forward-looking process metrics that we think will drive performance, but we also do show them the admissions, because even if it's not always as actionable, because someone who was in the hospital 2 weeks ago, you can't prevent that from happening, it happened, but we do want people to kind of never forget that that's the North Star, as we also have them focus on some of the process metrics day to day.
Yep. And we will definitely dive into those leading lagging indicators later in the conversation. So that makes sense. Maybe Colton, can you describe to the audience what your CareOps org chart looks like at Oak Street?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't actually describe it as an org chart. I think the things that we say all the time is we care a lot more about the operating model than we do about the org chart. CareOps is essentially embedded in everything that we do, and it is a naturally cross-functional thing that needs to happen. So we follow more of what we call kind of the 4 in the box model. It could be 3 in the box, it could be 2 in the box. But usually what that means is that we have a clinician, a product manager, maybe someone from operations, and someone from our technology or engineering teams partnering very closely and having shared accountability to certain outcomes. What that really allows us to do is make sure that all the expertise that we need to actually go try and solve those problems are working very, very closely together. I talk to my product team all the time, and I say, it's much more important that you are aligned with the people you're in the box with who are not a part of the product org than it is that you're aligned with the product org. It's in order for them to be able to drive the outcomes they need to work extremely closely together. And like I said, it can be 4 in the box. It can have design in the box sometimes. Sometimes clinical doesn't need to be there for other reasons. Sometimes it's only 2 people. It changes depending on what the goals are, but we find that is much more impactful than actually caring about the org chart.
And so how that works in practice was because when I was talking to Verta last month, they had, I think, a similar way of working. So they called it pods, and then each pod had like a certain area that they need to focus on. So they had a pod about patient engagement, a pod about hospital admission. Is that what you mean with that 4 in the box model?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think this might be a generally new structure for a lot of companies in healthcare. It's not a new structure outside of healthcare, right? I mean, this is how every tech company in the world operates. And we have pods. We use pods to refer to kind of our engineering teams that are working together to build functionality. We actually call them threads based on Amazon's kind of single threaded owner concept. But it's very similar. We're aligning them to different goals in the business, and they are jointly responsible for those things.
Yep. And so I obviously get a lot of questions of people after the Verta Health panel, like, how can we move towards a pod or like 4 in the box model? Because indeed, everyone has like a very typical org chart structure where you have clinical, product, engineering, and then they don't talk to each other. And then you have all the friction that CareOps obviously tries to prevent. So maybe David or Colton, I'm not sure who is the best to answer that. What advice would you give to people that today have an org chart and want to indeed move towards more of a collaboration model that you have in place?
I could start, and Colton.
Go ahead.
Colton's taught me most of this, so he'll have things to add. But I think that within the kind of Amazon framework, having the single thread owner is really critical, because at the end of the day, part of what leads to the silo not collaborating is not really having clarity on who's accountable and who has authority to do work. When we say this person is this single thread owner who's responsible for this top level KPI for the organization, and we have a governance structure that mandates that person then has authority to pull in people from across those different teams and provide direction on a day-to-day basis to those individuals, even if they're not their supervisor. they love doing that and it works well. I mean, you do have to sometimes educate people on what, if they're not used to working with someone from a particular discipline, kind of, teaching them about the value that they bring. You also have to hire people that bring that value and kind of demonstrate it for themselves. But I think the key is having, a clear, accountable leader who has the authority to convene people, to direct them, and then to have kind of a governance structure over that. That if someone tries to evade that, to say nope, this is how we do business. So we have something we call the Priorities and Resources Council that kind of is that governance structure that assigns those STO assignments and signs off if necessary on any kind of resource allocations to those STOs and the threads working on the KPIs, and I think that's worked quite well.
I think the quote that I always use is like, the best way to fail at doing something is to make it only part of somebody's job. And I think that the single thread owner concept is really designed around minimizing that as much as possible. It was a journey for Oak Street to get to this model, right? I don't want to make it seem like this was something that like always existed and happened overnight. If people are trying to move to this model, the best way to do it is to actually just do it. And what I mean by that is like, do it in a small area of the organization first. Do it in a part of the organization that is ready for that type of conversation, and see how it goes. And I almost guarantee it's going to work really well. And when it does, then you can kind of gain the buy-in you need to scale it more broadly.
That's great advice, because I literally at the end of every year, Colton and I and several other folks sit down and we review all the ways that it didn't go as we wanted it to. And there's always a ton of opportunities to make things better. But by doing that every year, we've kind of gotten closer and closer to what we think is an ideal state. And it's definitely been worth the effort and the journey.
Let's just do it. I think is great advice indeed. So CareOps is obviously all about taking care processes or designing care processes, implementing it in clinical practice, and then continuously improving it based on the data. And so the first step in doing CareOps properly is the design and validate phase, is what we call it. So it's designing, taking inputs, and then based on that, designing care processes that will drive better outcomes. So David, given your experience at multiple organizations, let's say that you, Colton, and myself start a new company tomorrow in the MA space, so not Oak Street Health. What steps would you follow to design the care flows that we need to indeed impact, for example, this reduction in admissions and to impact those leading and lagging indicators that we talked about?
I mean, this is a big question. Probably don't have time to do it to fully do it justice. I'd have to summarize everything that I've done in the last 6 years at Oak Street, plus what other people have done too to nail this. But at a high level, I mean, I think you have to first start with the patient population. It may sound funny, but you can really only prevent an event that was going to happen in the first place. So if you're trying to reduce admissions, you better first find a population that has admissions. If my parents are in their 80s, but honestly, they're so healthy that if someone gave me a population of patients like my parents and said, your job is to reduce admissions, I would, immediately say, no, thank you. I think, whereas at Oak Street, our patients really have multiple comorbidities, social challenges, high baseline costs. There's a lot to work with there. So first thing is look at the patient population that really provides the context for all the rest of the work. And, an example of that, even within Oak Street, where you say, well, there's high baseline costs, there's a lot of admissions to prevent. It's also key to know that the top admitting diagnosis is congestive heart failure. So better be doing some work on that if you're going to be, making progress here. Second, I would say, I really lean on the literature. I think that the existing medical literature contains a near exhaustive list of all the clinical interventions that are needed to succeed in value-based care and in healthcare in general. And the question is, how do you sort through that list? How do you pick the interventions that are going to be most impactful for the patient population that you're working with, and then to kind of organize that set of interventions that you choose to be executed. And I think that's where the human-centered design process and some engineering processes come into play, because it's one thing if your company is just doing one intervention, okay, that's hard enough to implement. But at a place like Oak Street, where we have dozens of simultaneous interventions that we're trying to execute, often through the same clinical care team, and so that really requires a lot of in-depth collaboration with the folks doing the work and figuring out how to make it easy for them to succeed. And so after we figured out what the patient population is, figured the interventions that are going to most target the challenges they have, then really tripling down on human-centered design and engineering approaches to really create something that's hopefully like an orchestra of different instruments being played, as opposed to kind of a chaotic cacophony that it could easily be if you don't approach it the right way.
Yeah, and so you pointed out indeed that Oak Street, it already exists for quite a while, so you already have a lot of processes in place, I assume, based on the literature that we have available. So maybe, Colton, under what conditions will you experiment with new care flows or care pathways, or is it more we already have everything established, we don't do any experimentations on that anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think the default is that we are always experimenting. I would say experimenting is 90% of what we're doing. Our care model is changing every single day. It's even though we've been around for a while, we can't stop doing this. There's always more admissions to prevent. There's always better ways we can take care of our patients. I think the best example or the best indicator that we're always experimenting is like when I look at Canopy. Canopy, for those who don't know, is the best way to describe it is the full stack EMR practice management pop health solution for Oak Street. It's really where our care flows get operationalized in the technology. There's probably 10 to 15 to sometimes more than that different things in beta at any given time. And that's really showing you that there's a ton of variability in what we're doing to try and find things that work. We're at a point where the things that we're doing are actually much more on the novel side than they are on the proven side. We know that our care model works really, really well at preventing admissions and taking good care of the populations that we serve. So we're really trying to push the boundaries of what exists in the industry right now. And really what that results in is our hypotheses about what's going to work are going to be wrong way more often than they are going to be right. Which means we have to try a lot of things very, very quickly. And we've structured ourselves to be able to iterate on those things quickly until we figure out what works to drive the outcome that we want. The literature is really helpful to kind of in that brainstorming process of what we could do, but actually figuring out what works with your unique population and your model is really what matters. I can give, Rik, if we have time, I can give a quick example of this. I think one of the biggest challenges as we've grown is it's really easy to do this type of orchestration when you only have a couple centers, right? You have the best people, you have the ability to actually manage it on that more granular level. When you have over 200 centers, the variability that actually happens across those centers and just adherence to different care flows is massive. And a lot of what the technology allows us to do is actually reduce that variability. So to give you an example, in 2021, Oak Street acquired Rubicon MD. For those who don't know, Rubicon MD is a e-consult platform for specialist care. And our providers have been using e-consults for a little while, not at scale, but really trying to get a feel for how they would help our patients. And what we found is that e-consults are pretty universally positive things for both Oak Street and for our patients. Around 30% of the time when you do an e-consult, it actually avoids the need to actually send the patient to a specialist. So that's good for Oak Street because it's lowers our medical spend on specialist care. But more importantly, it's incredibly valuable for our patients who don't actually have to go see a specialist. With our population, as David mentioned earlier, our patients have tons of mobility challenges. They have transportation challenges. It's really hard for them to get to a specialist. We were actually seeing something like 50% of the time when we were referring patients to a specialist, they weren't even going, right? So what the e-consult allows us to do is, one, when we submit an e-consult, it comes back in 3 hours. I don't have to wait weeks for the patient to go schedule a visit, go see the specialist, months in some cases. And for the 50% who weren't even going to the specialist in the first place, we have a lot more clinical information in the hands of our primary care doctors to actually take care of those patients absent them going to the specialist. So this is universally positive. It's also not something, it's new. It's not something that like a lot of primary care doctors have actually a ton of experience with. So when we first introduced e-consults and Rubicon into Oak Street, we integrated it into Canopy. We made it easy to submit an e-consult from Canopy. It was an option that you had. When you had that option, you could also submit a referral at the same time. When we integrated, it made it easier, right? So we went from maybe a couple hundred e-consults being submitted a quarter to maybe a couple thousand, but it was nowhere near the volume we thought it should be. So in this case, there was a clinical leader from one of our regions. I was actually playing the product manager role. We had a designer involved, and we went through a process of figuring out what are the things we can do to nudge people to use this tool. So we went through probably 6 or 7 different iterations. I would say that 6 or 7 different iterations failed miserably. Maybe not miserably is not the right word, but they didn't work, right? We didn't see a huge spike in volume usage. So we got to a point where we actually had to get clinical buy-in that we actually need to enforce this workflow in our tools. And we're at a point now where for most referrals, you actually have to submit an e-consult first before you can refer the patient. It doesn't delay patient care because the responses are so quick, but it does drive increased utilization of this tool that is incredibly valuable for our business and our patients. I would say last year, the year before we did this, we probably did 7,000 e-consults. Last year, we did well over 100,000. And this year, we will likely do over 200,000. So by kind of going through this rapid iteration to see what actually works well, we were able to get to a point where this became innate in our care model, and it's provided a lot of value for our patients.
Yep, I love that story. And maybe a quick question, because this can be a rabbit hole, but maybe, David, how do you as a clinical leader pick the experiments that you want to do? Because I imagine that the list is pretty big and the backlog is just as engineering also pretty big. So how do you pick the right things to focus on as an organization?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I would say clinicians tend to be very creative and passionate about these kinds of things. It's tough when you're in clinic every day and you see these massive problems that our patients are facing and want to solve them. You realize sometimes it goes beyond just what you can do by following the existing protocols. You have to do something new. And so we definitely have a lot of passionate contributions from our teams, and I think the product and design teams have done a great job of listening to those teams to make sure that their input is taken into account in the solutioning. And then once again, looking at the data, sometimes people say, hey, I want to solve this problem, but we look at the data and it's a really small problem in the big picture. And so we try not to, focus on that yet. We say, yeah, that's a great idea. We're going to do that someday. But right now we're going to focus on something that's having a bigger impact. And then, sometimes people also want to be creative and come up with their own ideas, but then we also double check with the literature, because sometimes it's like, well, that's a interesting idea, but there's this really well thought out approach that has, lots of randomized trials proving its efficacy, and we might start there first for solving that problem. There was just a question in the chat about like behavioral health, and so an example of that would be We use this model called the collaborative care model, which is a way of integrating behavioral health into primary care. It's, there's over 80 randomized trials that, starting in the University of Washington and spreading across the country with different research teams. And, that's an example where everyone who does primary care, and especially with low-income populations, experiences a ton of challenges in their patients in behavioral health. But, if someone wants to kind of come up with a creative new way of doing it, it's okay. But, this model really works. And so we've really doubled down on it, and we've now have the largest implementation of collaborative care in the United States. And it's people sometimes still say, I don't really like this part about it. I don't like this. And we're like, okay, that's good. We'll take that into account. But we also want to make sure we're at a basic, like implementing the model with fidelity, and then kind of we can be creative on the margins there too.
I love how you always come back to scientific evidence, because when we do like a yearly survey and ask like, how are you doing CareOps? And we found that I think about 16% uses medical research to drive iteration and experimentation. So the fact that you really hammer on that point of like using the evidence that is out there, I hope next year that should be 100%. So I think it's a very important point. Maybe, obviously, Colton, maybe a question to you. All providers are burned out, and the thing that we hate most is tab switching, like switching context and all of that. So many guests in the past already emphasized the importance of having your product, which in your case is Canopy, inform the care flow while also allowing some autonomy and creativity from the provider to deviate from the protocol that was designed by David and the team. So given that you have a homegrown EHR, does that allow you to have the full flexibility to do that? Or how do you look at that from a product lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the way that I describe the value of Canopy is, when we talk about population health programs that are run outside of Oak Street, people, the first time someone sees Canopy, they're like, where are all the reports and dashboards that show me how my team is performing? And what ends up happening is you have a population health tool that has like a bunch of insights in it, and it lives off to the side. And then nobody looks at it, or they don't look at it at a time when they can do anything about it. So the important thing is that we're embedding those insights directly into Canopy at the point of care, or when someone actually has a patient in front of them, so that they can take action on the things that matter most. I would say that there's everything that we build when we're designing new flows. To the point earlier, it is a joint effort, thinking about the operational strategy in mind. Right? Like we don't want to design something that just cannot be implemented. Granted, the breadth of things that we can implement because we have Canopy is much wider than a lot of areas, because we have full control over modifying those things. And in some cases, provider creativity is really important. I think in some cases, it's not. It's actually the opposite. And I think we've had great clinical leaders at Oak Street who can help us identify, like, when does this make sense to make it mandatory? You have to go do it, versus when is this something that is probably not the best thing to do to enforce. Our clinical teams, they are as busy as every other clinician in the world. I will say, though, that working with them has probably been my favorite part of working at Oak Street, because they are so engaged in actually helping us design the right systems for them to be able to do their job well. I can walk into any center at any given time, tell them who I am, and they will literally let me shadow them for the whole day, just like trailing around behind them, and give me all the feedback that I could ever ask for, which is an incredible value of working in product at Oak Street. I will say that when we do come up with a care flow, it's not like we just roll it out to everybody. We do test it. We do beta test it. We do ask for volunteers to actually participate in those things. And I will say that we have a problem that we have too many people raising their hands to be volunteers in those things, not too few, which just speaks to kind of the level of comfort with innovation that our care teams have, which is very exciting.
And so in our chat, you also mentioned that you then capture data to get feedback, and then based on the feedback, make changes, and that sometimes it can take days to make those changes. Sometimes it takes months to get that feedback. So what are some tactics that you employed to accelerate that lead time to change, like making those changes faster so you can learn faster and experiment faster as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to say anything novel here, right? The way to actually test and learn is something that's been proven in every other company outside of healthcare for a very long time. I will say that every product that we build, our design team, led by a woman named Lotus Lindes, who's fantastic, they will actually go and spend a bunch of time with our clinicians up front saying, okay, 40 or 50 clinicians, what do you think about this? Let's do some like simulations of how you would interact with this tool. Let's do some like usability studies. We prototype everything. So before we even write a single line of code, it's something that we've gotten tons of feedback on. So we know we're going into building something that has some value. Once we roll it out, we will turn it on for a couple of regions or maybe a couple of centers or a couple of providers. We've kind of built that into Canopy so we can do that. And we try and be diverse in the types of populations that we actually include in the beta test, that we can get a variety of feedback. And based on that feedback, it really depends on, you know, how wrong we were in our initial hypothesis as to how long it actually takes to fix it. Very rarely do we release something that is like so far off because we've done all that upfront work. But where we have challenges is like if our hypothesis was wrong, like it was in that e-console example, then we actually have to go back to the drawing board and think differently about the problem, that's what ends up taking longer more often than not. Usually the tool that we're going to roll out is usable and meets a certain threshold of quality that you can't like roll out true MVPs in a lot of areas. Like some areas you can, but in a lot of areas, there's a certain subset that is probably, the bar is probably a little higher that we have to meet before we actually get something in the hands of the clinician who is seeing a patient.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that, you know, one thing that Colton, you and the rest of the team have done a great job in is kind of boiling it down to the true MVP. So we don't try to roll out something that's super, super complicated all at once. You know, we try to find something that's meaningfully useful to the teams. And you're right, try not to throw out something that's, you know, half-baked, but kind of optimize that and then kind of build on it in an agile manner, as opposed to doing a once every 18 months big release of a giant complex piece of software.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think the MVP mindset does more harm than good, because you only have one shot to convince clinicians that the stuff that you're doing makes sense. But like shipping smaller things where it's much better than an MVP makes more sense to then gradually get to that buy-in that we are talking about. Now, I think the one thing that many organizations struggle with, which it seems to me something that Oak Street Health is doing very well, is creating that strong synergy between clinical ops, product design, compliance, engineering, all the stakeholders involved. And so besides the way that your organization is structured, do you have any working principles between those roles, which often speak totally different languages, in order to create that synergy between tech and clinical? Maybe a question to you, David.
Yeah, I think this honestly is a part of my job that brings me the greatest joy. I think typically in primary care doesn't usually have a lot of team members. I mean, the really competent operations people get sent to orthopedic surgery and oncology and somewhere where there's more of a bigger profit margin for the health system. And so, you know, we're lucky if we have a competent practice manager thrown our way typically. So at Oak Street to have, you know, to actually have a product team, to have a design team, to have software engineers, to have really top-notch clinical leaders and, you know, business leaders from top business schools and things all around the table is just, first of all, you know, an incredible foundational piece. I think then like kind of, I feel like my job as an executive is sort of forming these multidisciplinary teams, which, as Colton said, is more through the operating model than the org chart. And, once you kind of have the clear accountability and also giving that person the authority to do their job, to drive a particular KPI, and then pull the people together, you see people learning, oh, this is what a clinical leader is for in this kind of framework. This is what product does. This is what the design team brings to the table. We're delayed, but we finally have an architecture team, and it's very clear to me now as someone without a deep tech background. Oh, now I understand what architecture is for. They do fantastic work on the front end to make sure we don't build the wrong architecture to support our solutions and things like that. So, getting the people in the room, establishing the right culture where, it's a horizontal kind of feel, not like a top down, like the clinicians run it, or the business people run it, or the product people run it. I feel like once you create that environment and you get the right people around the table and you have a clear KPI that pod, or as thread, as we call it, is sort of running towards, then we just have to get out of people's way and, give them as few hurdles to jump over as possible. And it just kind of goes from there.
But I'll say, like, between product and clinical, what I found in working with a lot of our doctors is that the kind of baseline critical thinking skills that are really important for you to be strong in product are also the baseline critical thinking skills that are important for you to be strong in medicine. And I've found that there's actually a lot, we're very aligned in how we think about solving problems. It's a very structured methodology, at least for mental model, that allows us to work very closely together, because we tend to be thinking about how we go about identifying the problem to solve, making hypotheses, testing those hypotheses in a very similar way. So there's actually not as much of, while there might be like a content difference, the mental model for how we solve problems is very similar.
Yeah, I love that. And I also talk a lot to organizations where engineering knocks on the clinical door and then asks some questions, and then clinical gives feedback, and then engineering goes into their cave, and after 2 months they go, here we did something, and then they obviously after 2 months get a lot of feedback from clinical, like, this is not what I asked for. So I think the thing that you, Colton and David, emphasize again and again and again is creating that culture where people can have close feedback loops between each other. So it's not like 2 months into a cave, it's more a few hours into cave, getting feedback and then moving from there, which I think is the right recap. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, David's been my favorite person to have conversations with, because he helps us define the tools, and then he goes and uses them in clinic every Monday, right? And then he comes back, and then, every once in a while I get an email with like, I was doing this and these 3 things happened that I don't think make sense, right? So, and we have a lot of other clinicians who are very similar. Like, we have a lot of clinicians who are part-time seeing patients and part-time helping design some of these initiatives, which is extremely valuable, because it's, eating your own dog food approach.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, in some ways, I mean, I'm still, a primary care provider. I see patients. I do kind of the normal primary care provider things, but really, like, my job on that 1 day a week when I'm in clinic is like, beta tester across all things. And so at the end of every day, I have, chat messages and emails going out to, a wide variety of folks saying, like, you wouldn't believe how bad, the special way this particular initiative failed today in my center. And, I try to be lighthearted about it, because I know people work hard at these things and don't want to necessarily hear that, but it's really, really helps us kind of make fewer mistakes and course correct quicker.
Yeah. And also another thing that I noticed is that all good clinical leaders, they still practice. So that's also something that I noticed. So Dr. Ali Khan, which was the CMO of Oak Street for a very long time and is now recently became the CMO for Medicare and dual eligibility at Aetna. He had an article in recently about the fact that the quality metrics that we focus on are mostly process metrics, like the percentage of patients that got their A1C checked. And the problem with those measures or these metrics is that it's very check the box medicine. So what are some of the metrics or outcomes that you prioritize to really focus more on these leading indicators rather than these lagging indicators?
Yeah, it's a conversation we have a lot. Trying to define the right metrics for what we measure and what actually tells us if we're on the right track or not is very hard. So I think we need both, right? We need to know how the business is performing, but to David's point earlier, measuring something like 80K isn't going to tell us very much about the operations because there's so many things that go into that. So we really need to know really two things. One, are people following the care flow that we've designed as we intended it to be? And two, is that care flow having a meaningful impact on the ultimate outcome that we are trying to drive? The first is kind of that leading indicator that we can actually measure and like track on a day, hour, week basis. The second, a lot of times we don't know for a couple months, right? A lot of times we have to let this run for a little bit to see how have the outcomes changed. And we also have to design the kind of trials of those things in a way that allows us to understand from the data, is this actually the thing that's driving the outcome, not these other 20 confounding variables that could be actually addressing. So we're very deliberate in how we design some of these tests. If I see something that has like very low utilization but high impact, you know that I have a great idea, but the implementation needs. If I see something that has super high utilization but no impact, then it's probably that the idea wasn't that great or that the hypothesis was wrong. And that's why we beta test, right? Like we don't want to add something to people's plates that doesn't really work. So to give you an example, like leading indicator, I'll talk about the specialty care thing because I just told that story. Leading indicator for specialty care is e-consults per visit. How many e-consults are we submitting for every visit that exists? The lagging indicator is ultimately specialist utilization and patient NPS. And like how much are our patients actually going to see specialists, and ultimately what is the cost of that? Like how much are we spending in Part B? But we have a variety of situations like that where we have to look at the leading indicator and continuously determine if that is the right leading indicator for what we're trying to actually drive from the business.
And not sure if this is confidential or not. If so, feel free to decline the question. But David, do you have like an example of other leading indicators? For example, what would be the leading indicator to predict hospital admissions, for example? Or is it all based on the data and the scientific evidence again? Or how have you landed on those metrics, and what are those, if you can share anything?
Yeah, it's admissions is a tough one because there are a lot of different clinical things that can lead someone to be in the hospital, and some of them, I mean, I routinely send patients to hospital too because sometimes they have a particular condition and a particular clinical situation that the hospital is the absolute right place to provide the right care to that patient. So we're really only trying to prevent admissions that are someone getting sick from a chronic condition that didn't need to happen, or a new condition that's propped up because we didn't prevent it in the first place. And so it's a bit of a numbers game. Congestive heart failure is number one. That's the number one admitting diagnosis for our patients. And so we have a lot of leading indicators related to heart failure, such as, I talked about the sort of 80 plus randomized trials for collaborative care. Well, I mean, the number of randomized trials looking at heart failure treatment with medications, I don't think anyone knows the number. It's so big. It's, got to be tens of thousands of medication trials. And so boiling all those down together, there's, people kind of use this term guideline directed medical therapy, which is really using a whole bunch of medicines together at the right target doses. And it's very clear if you do that, you dramatically reduce their admissions to the hospital. And And yet, in most populations across the country in the US, single digit percentages of patients with advanced heart failure are optimized on guideline directed medical therapy. And so a leading indicator there would be, okay, every time I see a patient who has advanced heart failure, where are they in that journey to getting to the target doses of all those medicines? And so we prompt the care team to say, hey, it looks like it's, based on their blood pressure, heart rate, and the current dosage of their medications, it looks like it's time to titrate, medication X. And it's not, I mean, a lot of it is, it's very algorithmic. We don't have to create any kind of new intellectual property, through that. It's literally just cut and paste directly out of the randomized trials that showed that these medicines work. There are a lot of startups that I see. Literally, I was being asked by our CEO this morning about a startup that was using these protocols. I said, yep, those protocols really work. Unfortunately, it's not intellectual property, so that startup could, there are 5 other startups that are doing that exact same thing right now, and then they may not have much of a moat to prevent them from being swallowed up but nonetheless, we use it, and the leading indicators are really like, how close are your panel of patients with advanced heart failure to being on, across the board on guideline directed therapy. So that's one niche, but those things only apply to certain kinds of heart failure. There's also COPD, there's depression, there's, and we have leading indicators for all these conditions that we optimize. And then we also sort of step back and say, well, across all of that, who are the patients who are just globally at high risk? And often the global high risk has more to do with social challenges, than just medical challenges. And so, although it's really a mixture of both. So we also have machine learning algorithms that, identify those high risk patients and send them through certain care pathways that will make sure that we're having multidisciplinary discussions about those patients. And those discussions sometimes are about, getting them to the guideline directed therapy for their chronic conditions. And sometimes it's like, wow, they're living alone, they're really lonely, they're depressed, they don't really have a motivation to take their medicines, they need, durable medical equipment in their house to keep them from falling, they need to move to a new housing place because they can't go up and down stairs anymore, so they can't get to the grocery store. It's all over the map. So, we have we have a wide range of leading indicators that we track. Because for better or worse, primary care with this kind of population is a very complex thing, and you can't boil it down to one thing.
Yep, I think that's clear. An observation that I have is we have indeed all the scientific evidence, but then some startups, they still want to reprove the things that are already proven. Well, what you say is just take the playbooks that already exist and experiment based on top of that. The one issue that I would love to get your thought on is obviously the amount of medical research is like increasing. So it's very hard to see the trees versus the forest. So do you have like a full-time team that is only focused on like digesting new medical research, or is it you in your bed just before sleep? Like, how do I need to see that? Like, how do you take all this literature and then implement that into your care model?
It's a great question. I think I am certain that I'm every day missing lots of very valuable medical literature. I think some of it comes from just working for 25 years in the same niche of primary care for adults. And a lot of these things, there's probably something brand new today that I don't know about, but the stuff that people have been working on for literally decades for improving outcomes in this population, by now I've stumbled upon it or been educated by others. And so, we don't have to necessarily be on the cutting edge. Sometimes it's just something that's been proven for decades to work that for some reason no one's doing usually because the incentives are not there in fee-for-service medicine to actually do it. We just kind of have cataloged those from a combination of, yes, reading the literature, talking to other experts. I still have an academic appointment at Northwestern. I'm an associate clinical professor of medicine at Northwestern. So I talk to those folks, and give me advice. They pull us in on new trials that are being done and say, hey, this thing really works. And I'm like, I don't know. I've never heard of it. Oh, can we implement this with your patients as part of our NIH trial? Okay, yeah, let's do it. So it's through a number of channels.
Yeah. I think the theme that you're probably seeing as we talk through these things is like the hardest problem that we have to solve is how to operationalize these things at scale. And I think that there is a ton of literature out there, but to the point David made earlier, the hardest part is how do they all come together so that we're targeting the right interventions at the right patients at the right time in a way that is easy for the patient to follow the things that we're asking them to do, that will ultimately keep them out of the hospital. And I think the work that we do, the reason for Canopy's existence is to enable us to operationalize these things at scale. I have never seen it worked if you don't have that type of control over the workflows. And I think that type of control over the workflows is fundamental to being able to do this well, when we're 200 centers, when we're 1,000 centers, when we're all across the country. So I think that's definitely one of the harder challenges without the type of literature to help us solve. When I look at other startups or other businesses who are trying to do these similar things that we're doing, they don't have that type of control, and they really struggle to get the type of adherence to those workflows.
So what you're saying between the lines is that you need to have something beyond the EHR where you have the full flexibility, where you can do things that are outside of the limitations of the current systems that already exist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, the EHR is, I mean, if there was an EHR that allowed you to do these things, the EHR is great. There isn't. At the end of the day, we've seen some newer players in the market starting to move to a world where this is actually becoming something that is offered as a value to going with their platform. You see companies like Elation, like Canvas that are out there starting to think through, like, how do I actually allow people to build on top of the ecosystem that I've created? That historically has not been the kind of modus operandi of other EHR businesses. And I think that there's a ton of opportunity for those companies that want to do that as more businesses like Oak Street pop up across the country.
Yeah, that's food for thought. Maybe because you only have 2 minutes, quick fire round question, like last question. David, starting with you, what would be the one point of advice be to the audience of to a person or organization? Like tomorrow we want to start this smart, fast experimentation as well at our organization. What advice would you give them with all the experience that you now have at Oak Street and other orgs?
I think really the key that we've talked about already is forming this multidisciplinary team. I mean, I think that just having a product team and having folks like Colton who come in with sort of outside of at least the part of healthcare that I'm associated with, knowledge of, well, this is how tech teams work. This is how tech teams solve these problems from a process perspective. I mean, it's really kind of been incredibly enlightening, not just in the content of solving individual problems, but also just kind of knowing how to organize teams and all that. It's been really fun and impactful.
And Colton, same question to you. Besides own your EHR or CRM, besides that, any leading or last thought or advice that you want to give to the audience?
No, I mean, I think we are in a very interesting time in healthcare where we're seeing more of these kind of innovative care models pop up. I think the success of these care models is really what David just said. It's really dependent on a group of people with diverse experiences working very, very well together. And I will say to people who are trying to do this, like, baby steps are actually big steps. I've been at Oak Street for 5 years, and every year we've taken a step forward to get to where we are today. I think that it doesn't change overnight, particularly in big organizations that are kind of lethargic and hard to move. But it's really important to start doing this work and be comfortable that it will take a little bit, But once you get there, the rewards are really high.
Yeah. So we don't need disruption, we need improvement. So I think that's it's a nice gist. Thank you so
Well, we
much.
need disruption in some places, Rick, just
Yeah,
not this
that's
one.
true. I do agree with that. Thank you so much for your time. This was super interesting for me. I obviously also want to continuously improve my own game. So for people that have feedback, I send a link in the chat. And if you give me some feedback, I will send you a CareOps t-shirt that you can wear with pride. And then obviously Colton and David, I will ping you to also send you one so you can also wear that as well. So thank you so much for sharing the wisdom and best of luck with more experimentation and more progress and baby steps and disruption in some places.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.